Welcome to Lesson 2. We're going to cover punctuation, accentuation, and have an overview of nouns and verbs. So you should turn to page 6 in your Bob Jones Handbook and follow along. First thing we want to look at is punctuation, and this is a review for most of you. The Greek comma and period are the same as in English, and in this sentence, I know you who you are. Notice that there's a comma after the E. Then o agios to theou, there's a period. Those function just like English commas and periods. A raised dot in Greek, which is right here, is equivalent to an English colon or a semicolon. And a Greek question mark looks like a semicolon. So, for example, in this sentence, legon, there's a raised dot right after legon, indicating that there's a semicolon or a colon here, following the direct quote, Ti emin ke su Yesu Nazarene. What do you have to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Ilthes apolese emas. And then you see the semicolon at the very end, and that's indicating a question mark. Ilthes apolese emas. Did you come to destroy us? So those are the elements of punctuation that occur in our Greek New Testaments. You should be aware that there was no punctuation when Paul wrote the New Testament books that he wrote, or any other New Testament writer for that matter. And the punctuation has all been added by editors of the Greek New Testaments that we use today. Now let's talk about accentuation. When you look at a Greek word, it can be divided up into syllables. And the last 3 syllables of any word are named so that we can talk about where to place accents. The last syllable in a word is the ultima, the second to last is the penult, and the third to last is the antepenult. In words longer than 3 syllables, the other syllables are not named. So, for example, we're looking at anthropos here in the box. Pos is the ultima, thro is the penult, and on is the antepenult. So you work backwards from the end of the word toward its beginning. Now when it comes to accentuation, there are some general rules that are here on the bottom of the page, and then there are specific rules. You do need to know the general rules. The first has to do with verb accentuation. With verbs, the accent will move as far from the ultima as the specific rules permit. Verbs therefore have recessive accent. Recessive means that it recedes from the end toward the beginning as the rules allow. Noun accentuation, on the other hand, is persistent, which means that the accent tries to stay on the syllable that it started on in the lexical form, and I'll explain what a lexical form is in just a moment, if at all possible. Now, there would be instances in which it would have to move back toward the ultima, but noun accent is persistent. That's the key word. Verbs recessive, nouns persistent. The textbook gives you an example there with uios. The accent is on the ultima, the syllable os, and will stay there regardless of the ending. So that covers punctuation, accentuation, and the general rules for accentuation. Now we come to the specific rules. When we look at the specific rules, the first one you have to know. The following rules are optional. The first rule states that the acute accent can stand on any of the last 3 syllables. The circumflex can stand on either of the last 2, but only the last 2. and the grave accent can stand only on the last. So here you see an example of an acute accent, which is on the penult. Here the acute is on the ultima, and here it is on the antepenult. On the other hand, here is a circumflex, which is over the ultima. Here is a circumflex over the penult. The circumflex will never occur on the antepenult. And the grave accent here occurs only on the ultima. Now, I went through those examples just to show you what rule number 1 is talking about. If you would like to learn how to accentuate Greek nouns and verbs, you do need to learn the optional rules. But I do not require that in this course. I expose you to them and leave it up to you whether you will learn them. Moving on now to the next section, critical diacritics. This is a kind of a humorous title that my boss, Dr. Sam Schneider, added here. And a critical diacritic is an accent mark, breathing mark, or iota subscript that distinguishes two words that are otherwise spelled the same. Normally the context is sufficient to distinguish such words from one another. One example is the word the, O, and the word that or which, O. They're both pronounced the same, whether in a Rasmussian or reconstructed Cunei pronunciation. The only difference is the acute accent that occurs on the form O, which means that or which. Proclitics and enclitics. When a word is pronounced in close association with an adjacent word so that it loses its accent, it is a proclitic or an enclitic. A proclitic loses its accent to the word that follows it. An enclitic loses its accent to the word that preceded it. So this is how I think of it. Enclitics go before, proclitics go after, E before, P after. An example of an enclitic is the pronoun mu, which means my. So the word name, onoma, when followed by mu, is pronounced onomamu. The accent of the mu shifted back to the last syllable of onoma, which is why in the Lord's Prayer, may your name be sanctified, agiastheto, to onomasu, instead of onomasu. Su is an enclitic and loses its accent to the last syllable of onoma. So agiastheto to onomasu. And that's all there is to proclitics and enclitics. Moving on to page 8, we have an overview of the verbs. First thing you need to note is that Greek verbs have 5 key characteristics. They are tense, voice, mood, person, and number. I will abbreviate tense, voice, mood, person, and number as TVMPN, just using the first letters of the words. Now, let's look at the first of those characteristics, tense. Tense indicates the time and kind of action of a verb. This is really crucial. We're used to, in English, tense indicating only the time when an act happens. But Greek verbs indicate not only time, whether it's semeron, ekthés, or avrion, future, avrion, present, semeron, ekthés, past. But it also indicates the kind of action involved. I introduced this concept to you last semester, but here's a chart that describes this. There are 6 tenses in Greek, and they are listed here on the left-hand side in this chart. And this chart groups these tenses by the kind of action being expressed by the tense. present and imperfect tenses are linear, progressive, or continuous. That is, the action is viewed as being in progress. It's like watching a video. For example, present is I am studying. The imperfect, I was studying. Both of those indicate continuous action, one in the present, the other in the past. The future and the aorist tenses, and please note that this is pronounced aorist, it is not pronounced aorist, communicate or portray simple or undefined action. In other words, the author's not telling you how long it took, whether it happened repeatedly, whether it's finished or not. He's just saying the action will happen in the case of the future, or did happen in the case of the past. You can contrast the linear or progressive kind of action with the simple, as the linear is a video and the simple is a snapshot, catches the action in a single shot. Then there are the perfect and pluperfect tenses. Both of these are past tenses, and they both indicate action that was completed in the past with results that continued for a time after the completion of the act. The perfect tense, we'll see, views the action as completed with the results continuing up to the present time, whereas the pluperfect indicates an action that was completed with results that continued up to a point in the past but are no longer in effect. And the English examples, I have studied versus I had studied. Now, just looking at this chart as a whole, let me point out that this is part of the genius of the Greek language, or what makes it unique. That these kinds of action are very important then in how we understand what the New Testament authors, or any Koine Greek author, is trying to communicate by their use of tenses. So it'll be very important for us to learn to recognize tenses and to know what those tenses communicate. On your grammar review, you will have to know that tense indicates both time and kind of action. So that's the first characteristic of verbs. The second characteristic of verbs is voice. Voice indicates the relationship of a verb's action to its subject. Now, in English, we don't talk about voice much, so this is probably a new concept for you. So pay close attention here. Three kinds of voices in Greek. They are active, passive, and middle. Active and passive we should be at least somewhat familiar with in English. In the active voice, the subject performs the action of the verb. For example, Andy hit the ball and Christ arose. Hit and arose are both active. The subject is doing the action. With the passive voice, however, the subject receives the action of the verb. The subject doesn't do the action, the subject receives the action. So the examples here, the ball was hit by Andy. The ball didn't hit Andy, the ball was hit. It received the action of hitting, and Andy was doing that action. Christ was raised. Christ didn't do the raising, at least in this sentence. Christ was being raised, we could say, by the glory of the Father. So, active, the subject performs the action. Passive, the subject receives the action. We're used to this in English, but Greek has a third voice. It's called the middle voice, where the subject acts in his own interest or upon himself. The middle voice is unique to Greek from an English perspective. The examples that we see here in the textbook, Andy hit the ball for himself. This focuses on the reason Andy hit the ball. He had some self-interest in view. Or the second example, Christ raised himself. Here we have the subject acting on itself, and the middle voice can communicate this as well. We'll learn how to recognize these three voices. This is just the introduction to